we're still in the pandemic. We're kind of like not in the pandemic. We're working, we're seeing people, we're not. But more than anything, I'm thinking to myself, where's the time gone? And how did we get to this point? How many fights have we gotten in over the last couple of years since the pandemic? And how many of those fights have been productive? That is the question I'm asking you guys today. Because while we have been in our corners, chirping away on Twitter, fighting the fight, sharing the memes, spreading the message, of course, there are very productive fights like labor fights on the ground, but I'm talking about let's say, like the online lefty universe. How many of these fights have been productive? Just a couple years ago, Steve Bannon was in Europe recruiting candidates. He actually had a school at a monastery in Italy, an old monastery, where he trained far right, essentially fascists, from all different parties across Europe on how to run for office, on the type of messaging that wins, the playbook for right populism, everything from leaning into China to targeting young white men who are distrusting institutions, to really leaning in on basically coded language against women. So they have been up to this for a while. He even said openly in the documentary The Brink to a reporter from The Guardian, the left-leaning Guardian, he even said openly to the Guardian reporter, oh, we need, for the next election cycle, we need 20% of your people, meaning 20% of the left. That was his strategy. Now, of course, his EU experiment did not work out so well, but that doesn't mean that the right wing went away in the EU. The UK suffered a loss yesterday, with one far-right member being lost, who was a key part of Boris Johnson's coalition. They lose a little, but the ideas are spreading. So I ask you, how many of the fights that you've gotten into in the last 2 years have been productive fights? Maybe 70%, maybe 20%? But I think moving forward into the new year, given that this is one of our last shows before the new year, we have to be thinking about how we fight. We have 11 months until the election in November. 11 months in which we are very likely to lose our coalition. I say that because I think a lot of us wouldn't align with the establishment's choices, but the coalition of Democrats, right? The coalition of the broader left. We have 11 months until the Senate is likely lost, and definitely Congress is lost to Republicans. Except now, whether or not Donald Trump runs or doesn't run in 2024, or whether or not Joe Biden wins or doesn't win, the ideas that Trump spread, that are spreading all over the globe, that are continued, they're being shared, they're beyond capacity at this point, meaning some of these ideas started in churches 40 years ago. Some of these ideas started to spread with this new strategy with the Koch brothers funding. Some of it was Reagan. All of this stuff goes back. Nixon, you can go as far back as, early colonial days, Columbus, right? But in terms of this modern day strategy, it is very much based on a strategy that Bannon's been putting into practice, a strategy that he's been studying from 1938. So I ask you right now, we have 11 months. 11 months. Are we going to defeat the right? Are we going to depend solely on the Democrats, or are we going to come up with a new strategy? I can tell you one thing I've learned from reading books, watching movies, and reading endless reports on Steve Bannon, and even working in Europe a couple of times in the last few years to defeat the right wing. I can tell you one thing I've learned. One universal aspect of this movement, depending on which flavor of a fascist they are, which country they're from, which party they're up against, whether it's the center left or the center right or the progressives, a unifying factor is a total, I'm saying this very clearly because I want you to understand this. There's a targeted level of attacks against women. It is a rallying cry. I want to talk about women because it's Femme Friday. I believe that the pathway, and we can see this the way that they target the squad, the way that they target Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton, there is misogyny all over the place. But why is this extremely dangerous right now? Not just because it is something that they unify around. It's not just because, they look at Jordan Peterson and say, well, he is such a brilliant man. Well, guess what? Someone who comes in through Jordan Peterson may come out like an absolute fascist. Or maybe not. It's just a coalition. They'll vote for whatever person on the right they see, and they'll be brought in whichever way. It could be Joe Rogan. It could be Jordan Peterson. It could be Tim Pool. It could be Dr. Oz. But why is this dangerous right now? Not just because there's a misogyny across the board, whether it's how they talk to women, whether it's their stance on economic issues that they don't understand affects women. Sometimes they're not even conscious. Most times they're not even conscious of the fact that they're being misogynistic. And this occurs on the left too, which is why I will not back down on this issue. Because if you want to defeat these guys, we have to talk about the misogyny. We have to define the misogyny. Well, here we go. This pandemic, do you know who suffered the consequences of this pandemic economically the most? Almost 90% of the women who lost jobs in 2020, almost 90% exited the labor force completely. And they're not going back. This is what the stats say. This is not just bad for the economy and bad for women's rights. This is bad across the board. This is bad for health. This is bad for childcare. Women make up the most reliable aspect of the workforce. They produce more. So it's actually bad for capitalism. This is horrifying. If we want to beat the fascists, if those of you out there who believe that we are taking on capitalism, you need to understand that capitalism is tied into the patriarchy. The Proud Boys, I don't think anybody is shocked to hear that they're misogynistic. The Proud Boys are now investing in local races, in school boards. They're going to be running in city councils. I already know of one candidate who's a teacher, a woman who's running for school board, because that makes sense, right? And she's stressing out because she's being labeled as the CRT lady by a Proud Boy member. This is the fight. Women are on the front lines of the pandemic, and now women need to be on the front lines of fascism, taking on fascism, because there's nothing that scares that guy more than a teacher, a woman who understands education, who understands her community, who's a union member, who's organized. Maybe she did it in Arizona and she was part of that uprising. They are scared of that. That is what they're scared of. But that is what it's going to take to win. Because if we don't do this, then what is the alternative? Are we just going to sink another, $1 billion into the Democratic Party ad strategy? That's really been working. So we have to think strategically right now. What are they afraid of? Well, clearly they're afraid of Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Nancy Pelosi. I mean, it doesn't matter. They don't care what kind of woman. They're just afraid of women. And they say it out loud, and they use it as a rallying cry. They even target our show so that folks who watch our show suddenly spill over into their shows. That is their strategy. That is Bannon's strategy. He says it out loud. So if we think this is some theory, you got to get out of that mindset. We have 11 months. If we lose the Senate, Congress, and the presidency, and we're already in this state of affairs, how bad is it going to get?